The bullet found Rick Cameron's shoulder at exactly 8:15 on a Friday night, 3 seconds after he threw himself between a gunman and a terrified 5-year-old girl. Blood pooled beneath his work shirt as he shielded little Bella, her designer coat now stained crimson, her small hands clutching a pink phone that had been ringing unanswered. The masked robbers fled into the darkness, leaving Peterson's grocery store in chaos. Old fluorescent lights flickered over scattered cereal boxes and Rick's fading consciousness. Then, exactly 3 minutes later, the sound of expensive engines cut through Maplewood's quiet streets. Victoria Blackwood stepped from her Range Rover in a pristine business suit, her heels clicking against wet pavement as she rushed towards the store. She had come to pick up her daughter, expecting nothing more than a simple exchange. But when she saw the ambulance lights and her child covered in a stranger's blood, one question hung in the cold night air like smoke. Rick had been stocking the final shelf when Bella wandered into Peterson's grocery that evening, her expensive clothes marking her as different from the usual customers in this small New Hampshire town. The little girl clutched her pink phone like a lifeline, her blue eyes scanning the store with the careful wariness of a child accustomed to waiting alone. When Rick knelt beside her and asked gently who she was waiting for, Bella's voice barely rose above a whisper. "My mommy's coming to pick me up. She told me to wait here and not go outside." Something in her tone made Rick's chest tighten with recognition, the same note he heard in his own 7-year-old daughter Sophie's voice when she tried to be brave. Sophie looked up from her homework behind the counter, her brown eyes so much like her father's that customers often commented on the resemblance. She had been Rick's constant companion since her mother Rebecca died 2 years ago, turning the grocery store into an after-school refuge where math problems competed with inventory lists for space on the scarred wooden counter. Rick watched as Sophie shyly offered Bella a piece of candy from her backpack, the universal language of childhood friendship, bridging the gap between designer clothes and thrift store finds. The girls began to chat about unicorns and favorite colors while Rick finished his closing routine, their innocent laughter filling the empty aisles with warmth. The bell above the door chimed with unusual violence as 2 figures burst through the entrance, their faces hidden behind ski masks despite the mild October weather. Rick's instincts screamed danger even before the taller man pulled a chrome pistol from his jacket, the metal catching the harsh fluorescent light like a promise of violence. "Everyone on the ground. Now!" The shorter robber flipped the store sign to closed and twisted the deadbolt with practiced efficiency, while his partner swept the gun across the small space. Bella's candy fell from nerveless fingers as she began to cry, the sound high and desperate in the sudden stillness. Sophie ducked behind the counter without being told, her homework forgotten as primal fear took hold. Old Mr. Peterson, the store's owner, emerged from the back office with his hands already raised, his weathered face pale but determined to protect his customers. The robbers moved with choreographed precision, one covering the store while the other advanced on the register, their demands sharp and urgent in the confined space. But it was Bella's terrified sobbing that shattered the fragile calm, her small voice calling for her mother, cutting through the tension like a blade. The gunman whirled toward her with visible irritation, his weapon tracking to follow his gaze as his patience snapped. "Shut that kid up, or I'll shut her up myself." Time compressed into crystalline clarity as Rick saw the barrel swing towards the little girl who had been laughing about unicorns just moments before. Rick didn't remember making the decision to move. 1 second he was frozen behind a display of breakfast cereals, the next he was diving across the narrow aisle with his arms spread wide to shield Bella from whatever came next. The gunshot was impossibly loud in the enclosed space, a thunderclap that seemed to steal all other sound from the world as burning agony bloomed across his shoulder. He felt himself falling, his body becoming a wall between the gunman and the child as they crashed to the linoleum floor together. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard Sophie screaming his name and Bella's renewed sobs, but they seemed to come from very far away. The robbers were shouting at each other now, their careful plan dissolving into panic as they realized they had crossed a line they never intended to cross. "What did you do? We weren't supposed to shoot anyone!" The shorter man's voice cracked with fear as his partner stared down at Rick's bleeding form, the weapon trembling in his grip. They grabbed handfuls of cash from the register and Peterson's wallet before fleeing into the night, leaving the door wide open behind them like an accusation. Rick pressed his good hand against his shoulder, feeling warm blood seep between his fingers as he looked down at Bella's tear-streaked face. The little girl was unhurt, but terrified, her expensive coat now bearing crimson stains that would never wash clean. Sophie emerged from behind the counter like a small ghost, her face white with shock as she knelt beside her father with the careful precision of a child who had already lost one parent. The ambulance arrived within minutes, summoned by Peterson's shaking hands and urgent voice, but it was the convoy of luxury vehicles that followed 3 minutes later that truly caught everyone's attention. Victoria Blackwood stepped from her Range Rover with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to commanding boardrooms and billion-dollar decisions, her tailored suit and confident bearing marking her as someone from a different world entirely. She moved towards the store with purposeful strides, her professional composure cracking only when she saw her daughter covered in blood that wasn't her own. The paramedics were already working on Rick, their practiced hands stanching the bleeding as they prepared him for transport to Mercy General Hospital 15 miles away. Victoria knelt beside Bella with the desperate intensity of a mother confronting her worst nightmare, her manicured hands trembling as she checked her daughter for injuries. "Baby, are you hurt? Tell Mommy what happened." Bella's explanation came in broken sobs and fragments, her small voice describing the scary men and the loud noise and the nice man who had fallen on top of her. Victoria's gaze found Rick's face as the paramedics lifted him onto their gurney, his eyes struggling to focus through pain and blood loss, but still alert enough to meet her stare. She saw no expectation there, no demand for gratitude or recognition, just the quiet satisfaction of a man who had done what needed to be done. Rick spent 3 days in the hospital, his shoulder rebuilt with titanium screws and a surgeon's careful precision, while Sophie stayed with their neighbor, Mrs. Chen, and worried herself sick. Victoria appeared on the 2nd day with flowers and a small stuffed unicorn for Sophie, introducing herself simply as Tori, and explaining that she wanted to thank the man who had saved her daughter's life. She sat beside Rick's bed with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to hospital visits, though her reasons were usually related to board meetings in medical facilities her company had acquired rather than gunshot wounds and grocery store heroics. Sophie warmed to Tori immediately, perhaps recognizing a kindred spirit in someone else who understood the weight of adult responsibilities. The 3 of them talked about books and school and Sophie's drawings, while Rick dozed fitfully between pain medication doses, the conversation flowing with surprising ease despite the unusual circumstances of their meeting. Tori seemed genuinely interested in Sophie's artwork and Rick's photography hobby, asking thoughtful questions that revealed an intelligence sharpened by years of corporate negotiations, but tempered by something softer when she looked at her own daughter. When Rick was finally discharged, Tori insisted on driving them home, her Range Rover feeling absurdly luxurious after Rick's beat-up Honda Civic, with its temperamental air conditioning and radio that only picked up static. She helped carry his belongings to their small apartment above Chen's restaurant, her expensive heels clicking on the worn wooden stairs as she navigated the narrow hallway with careful precision. The modest space with its thrift store furniture and Sophie's drawings covering every available surface seemed to fascinate rather than appall her, as if she were studying an exhibit in a museum dedicated to authentic American life. The weeks that followed established a rhythm that surprised them all with its naturalness. Tori would appear at Peterson's grocery during Rick's evening shifts, Bella in tow for what she called grocery adventures that always seemed to coincide with his working hours. The girls became inseparable, their friendship transcending the obvious differences in their backgrounds as they built elaborate games in the store's aisles and shared secrets behind displays of canned goods. Rick found himself looking forward to these visits with an intensity that both pleased and worried him. Rebecca's memory still fresh enough to make any new feelings feel like a betrayal. Tori's presence brought an energy to the store that Rick hadn't realized was missing, her laughter mingling with the girls' voices as they convinced her to try local snacks and explained the intricacies of small-town social dynamics. She seemed genuinely delighted by simple pleasures, like Sophie's hand-drawn thank you cards and Rick's stories about his photography, her corporate polish giving way to something more authentic when she forgot to maintain her professional distance. The other customers began to accept her as part of the store's ecosystem, though Rick noticed the subtle ways she deflected personal questions and changed the subject when anyone asked too much about her work. It was Bella who first mentioned her mother's big office with lots of computers during one of their afternoon visits, the comment slipping out with the casual innocence of childhood while Tori was examining Rick's latest photographs. Rick caught the sharp look that crossed Tori's face before she smoothly redirected the conversation to Sophie's upcoming school art show, but the moment lodged in his memory like a splinter. There were other small inconsistencies, too. The way Tori's phone was always on silent but constantly lighting up with notifications, her detailed knowledge of business regulations when Peterson asked her advice about supplier contracts, and the expensive car that seemed at odds with her claim of being a freelance consultant. The school art show became a turning point in ways none of them anticipated, with both families attending as Sophie proudly displayed her drawings of heroes in everyday life. Rick's favorite piece showed him restocking shelves while wearing an invisible cape, the kind of perspective that only a 7-year-old could bring to the mundane realities of adult work. Tori stood beside him as they admired Sophie's artistic vision, her presence feeling natural despite the curious glances from other parents who clearly wondered about the elegant woman in designer clothes at their small-town elementary school function. The principal approached them during the reception, her friendly smile masking the sharp intelligence that had made her successful in the politics of public education. "Ms. Blackwood, I wanted to thank you personally for considering our school for your foundation's education initiative." The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle as Rick felt his understanding of the evening shift beneath his feet. Tori's face went carefully blank, the corporate mask sliding into place with practiced efficiency as she managed a non-committal response about still evaluating options. But Rick had heard enough corporate speak during Rebecca's cancer treatment to recognize evasion when he encountered it. The drive home was silent, except for the girls' chatter from the back seat, but Rick's mind was racing through the implications of what he had heard. A foundation suggested serious money, the kind of wealth that came with obligations and expectations that went far beyond freelance consulting work. He thought about the expensive car, the designer clothes, and Bella's casual mentions of helicopters and big offices, pieces of a puzzle that were beginning to form a picture he wasn't sure he wanted to see. When they reached his apartment building, Tori walked them to the door with unusual quietness, her goodbye feeling more like an ending than a temporary farewell. Rick spent the next morning in a haze of uncertainty, his shoulder aching as he tried to focus on inventory reports and customer service, while his mind churned through questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. The internet search felt like a betrayal, even as he typed Tori's name into the browser, but the results hit him with the force of a second gunshot wound. Victoria Blackwood, Chief Executive Officer of Blackwood Industries, stared back at him from a dozen corporate headshots and business magazine covers, her professional smile as polished as her public relations team could make it. The articles painted a picture of a woman who controlled a technology empire worth billions, whose companies developed software for everything from medical devices to defense contractors. She had been married to tech mogul Jonathan Sterling, until a highly publicized divorce 6 months earlier, a legal battle that had dominated business news cycles and left both parties claiming victory in different arenas. But it was the most recent article that made Rick's blood run cold, a business journal piece dated just 2 weeks earlier with the headline, "Blackwood CEO Facing Federal Investigation in Custody Dispute." According to the report, Sterling had filed charges claiming that Victoria had violated a court order by taking their daughter across state lines during an ongoing custody battle. The accusations included kidnapping and contempt of court, with Sterling's legal team arguing that Victoria was mentally unstable and posed a danger to their child. The federal investigation was reportedly focusing on whether Victoria had used her corporate resources to hide from law enforcement, turning what should have been a civil custody matter into a potential criminal case with serious implications for both her freedom and her company. Rick stared at the screen until the words blurred together, his world rearranging itself around this new understanding of who Tori really was and what her presence in Maplewood might mean. She wasn't a single mother seeking a fresh start in a small town. She was a billionaire CEO hiding from federal authorities while fighting for custody of her daughter. Every conversation they had shared, every moment of seeming intimacy, had been built on a foundation of lies that stretched back to the night she had first appeared at Peterson's grocery. The worst part was realizing that he had been falling in love with someone who might not even exist. The confrontation came that evening when Tori arrived for what had become their regular routine, Bella skipping ahead into the store while her mother followed with the cautious steps of someone who sensed that the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Rick waited until the girls were occupied with a new coloring book before approaching Tori near the pharmacy section, his voice carefully controlled despite the turmoil in his chest. "We need to talk. About who you really are, and why the FBI might be looking for you." The color drained from Tori's face as she realized that her carefully constructed facade had finally crumbled. The truth came out in fragments and explanations that only made the situation more complicated, each revelation adding new layers to an already impossible situation. Tori admitted that she was indeed Victoria Blackwood, but insisted that the custody battle was more complex than the news reports suggested. Sterling had used his wealth and connections to paint her as an unfit mother, hiring investigators to document her every move, and lawyers to twist her attempts to protect Bella into evidence of instability. The court order she had violated was the result of Sterling's manipulation, she claimed, a legal trap designed to separate her from her daughter permanently. "I brought Bella here because I thought we could disappear for a while, just until my lawyers could build a case that would expose Jonathan's abuse," Tori explained, her corporate composure finally cracking to reveal the frightened mother underneath. "I never meant to lie to you, but I couldn't risk anyone finding out where we were. If Jonathan's people trace us here, they'll use your relationship with me to destroy any credibility I have left in court." Rick felt the weight of her words settling over him like a shroud, the realization that loving her might have doomed both their families to a legal nightmare that could destroy everything they had built. The next morning brought federal agents to Peterson's grocery, like a plague of locusts, their badges and search warrants transforming the familiar space into a crime scene. Agent Karen Moss introduced herself with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to dealing with fugitives and uncooperative witnesses, her questions probing the nature of Rick's relationship with Victoria Blackwood and his knowledge of her legal troubles. The customers who had come for their morning coffee and newspapers found themselves witnesses to a federal investigation, their small-town gossip suddenly elevated to the level of evidence in a case that would determine the fate of a 5-year-old girl. Rick answered the agent's questions with careful honesty, admitting that he had developed feelings for Tori, but insisting that he had known nothing about her legal troubles until the previous day. Agent Moss seemed skeptical of his claimed ignorance, pointing out that harboring a fugitive carried serious federal penalties regardless of romantic motivations. The search of his apartment yielded Bella's drawings and a coffee cup with Tori's fingerprints, physical evidence of a relationship that was now being dissected by federal prosecutors looking for patterns of conspiracy and obstruction of justice. The media attention that followed was everything Rick had feared, and worse, with news vans parked outside Peterson's grocery and reporters shoving microphones in Sophie's face as she tried to walk to school. The headlines painted him as either a naive victim of a manipulative billionaire or a willing accomplice in a federal crime, depending on which outlet was telling the story. Mrs. Chen stopped speaking to him after reporters began questioning her about suspicious activity in the neighborhood, and Peterson gently suggested that Rick might want to take some time off until the situation resolved itself. Sophie's world collapsed with the terrifying efficiency of childhood trauma, her safe spaces invaded by strangers with cameras and questions she couldn't understand. The other children at school repeated things they had heard their parents saying, turning Bella's name into a playground taunt and Rick's heroism into something shameful and suspect. The child psychologist that social services mandated described Sophie's drawings as concerning, noting the prevalence of cages and bars in her recent artwork as evidence of psychological distress that might require intervention. Jonathan Sterling arrived in Maplewood like a conquering general, his convoy of luxury vehicles and legal team transforming the small town into a battlefield for a custody dispute that had grown far beyond its original boundaries. He held press conferences on the courthouse steps, his polished appearance and carefully crafted statements painting Victoria as a dangerous fugitive who had manipulated local residents into harboring her. Rick watched from his apartment window as Sterling's public relations machine worked to destroy any sympathy Victoria might have earned, turning their love story into a cautionary tale about the lengths wealthy criminals would go to avoid justice. The federal courthouse in Concord became the arena for a legal battle that would determine not just Bella's future, but the fate of everyone who had been drawn into Victoria's orbit. Rick found himself subpoenaed to testify in a case where his honesty might send the woman he loved to federal prison, while his silence could be construed as obstruction of justice with consequences that would destroy Sophie's future. The lawyers explained his options with the cold precision of surgeons describing terminal cancer, each choice carrying consequences that would ripple through generations. Sterling's legal team had built their case on a foundation of documentation and expert testimony that painted Victoria as a master manipulator who had used her wealth and charm to evade justice. They presented evidence of her violation of court orders, her use of corporate resources to hide her location, and her pattern of deceptive behavior that stretched back months before her arrival in Maplewood. The federal prosecutor seemed convinced that Victoria represented a flight risk who would continue to evade justice unless she was held accountable for her contempt of court and violation of federal law. But Rick had spent weeks watching Victoria interact with Bella, seeing the genuine love and terror in her eyes as she fought to protect her daughter from a system that seemed designed to favor wealth over justice. He had researched Sterling's background during sleepless nights, discovering a pattern of legal victories that seemed to rely more on intimidation and financial pressure than actual evidence of parental fitness. The other ex-wives had been systematically destroyed in court, their reputations shredded, and their access to their children eliminated through legal maneuvers that left them financially ruined and emotionally devastated. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a domestic violence advocate with 30 years of experience, agreed to meet with Rick in a coffee shop 20 miles from Maplewood, her expertise providing context for the legal battle that was consuming his life. She explained how wealthy abusers used the court system as a weapon, hiring teams of lawyers and expert witnesses to overwhelm their victims with legal challenges that could continue for years. Victoria's case followed a familiar pattern, she said, with Sterling using his resources to create a narrative of mental instability that would justify removing Bella from her mother's care permanently. The evidence that Rick had gathered painted a different picture of the custody battle, one where a mother's attempts to protect her daughter were being twisted into proof of unfitness by a legal system that favored those with the deepest pockets. Sterling's pattern of behavior with previous wives suggested a man who viewed relationships as business deals and children as assets to be acquired and controlled. The recordings that Victoria had made of Sterling's threats were legally admissible, Dr. Martinez explained, but only if someone was willing to testify about their authenticity and the circumstances under which they were obtained. Rick's decision to testify on Victoria's behalf came with the knowledge that it would probably destroy his own life. But the alternative seemed even worse. Standing in the federal courthouse in his best suit and only tie, he felt the weight of Sophie's future pressing down on him like a physical force. The prosecutor's questions were designed to paint him as a naive victim of Victoria's manipulation. But Rick refused to cooperate with their narrative. He testified about the woman he had come to know, not the corporate executive in the photographs, describing her genuine love for Bella and her terror at the thought of losing her daughter to a man who viewed custody as another business acquisition. The trial lasted 3 weeks, with testimony from child psychologists, domestic violence experts, and investigators who had documented Sterling's pattern of abuse across multiple relationships. Victoria's lawyers presented evidence of Sterling's surveillance activities, his use of private investigators to harass his ex-wives, and his documented threats to destroy anyone who opposed him in court. The recordings of Sterling's voice threatening to make Victoria disappear permanently were played for a courtroom that included journalists from major networks and family law experts who would analyze every word for legal precedent. Agent Moss took the stand to explain how the FBI's investigation had revealed Sterling's use of illegal surveillance techniques and his attempts to bribe court officials in previous custody cases. The federal investigation that had originally targeted Victoria had shifted focus as evidence mounted of Sterling's systematic abuse of the legal system for personal vendettanz. 3 of Sterling's previous wives had come forward with similar stories of legal intimidation and emotional abuse, their testimonies creating a pattern that federal prosecutors could no longer ignore. The judge's ruling came on a Thursday afternoon in late November, the courthouse steps slippery with early snow as Rick waited for news that would determine the rest of his life. Victoria was cleared of all federal charges related to the custody dispute, with the judge ruling that her actions were those of a mother protecting her child from documented abuse rather than a criminal evading justice. Sterling was immediately arrested on federal charges including witness intimidation, bribery, and violation of civil rights under color of law, his empire of legal manipulation finally crumbling under the weight of his own arrogance. The media narrative shifted with the speed of a weather front, transforming Rick from a naive victim into a hero who had risked everything to expose a corrupt system that protected abusers while punishing their victims. Peterson's grocery became a symbol of small-town values, triumphing over corporate corruption, with customers traveling from neighboring states to shop at the store where an ordinary man had taken extraordinary risks to protect an innocent child. The photography exhibition that Rick had dreamed of became reality when a gallery in Boston offered to display his work, documenting the human cost of legal abuse. Victoria's return to Maplewood came without fanfare or press conferences, her Range Rover pulling up to Peterson's grocery on a quiet Sunday morning when the store was closed and the streets were empty, except for churchgoers and dog walkers. She found Rick restocking shelves in preparation for the Monday rush, his movements careful and deliberate as he worked around the shoulder that would never be quite the same. Bella ran to Sophie with the pure joy of childhood reunion, their friendship resuming as if the intervening months of legal warfare had been nothing more than a bad dream. The conversation between Rick and Victoria was quiet and careful, filled with the weight of everything they had endured and the knowledge that their relationship had been tested by forces beyond their control. She had sold her majority stake in Blackwood Industries, she explained, using the proceeds to establish a foundation that would provide legal support for mothers fighting wealthy abusers in custody court. The work was meaningful in ways that corporate acquisitions had never been, giving her a sense of purpose that went beyond stock prices and quarterly earnings reports. Rick's photography had evolved during the months of legal uncertainty, his camera becoming a tool for documenting the stories of other families caught in similar battles between love and law. The exhibition in Boston had led to assignments with national magazines, his work bringing attention to the systemic problems that allowed wealth to triumph over justice in family courts across the country. The foundation that Victoria had established became his primary client, their partnership extending beyond romance into a shared mission that felt larger than either of them individually. 18 months after the trial ended, Rick and Victoria stood in the renovated community center that had once been an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Maplewood, watching Sophie and Bella direct the hanging of photographs for an exhibition celebrating families who had survived legal warfare. The girls had appointed themselves as curators, their artistic vision creating unexpected juxtapositions between images of courtroom drama and everyday moments of resilience and hope. Rick's shoulder still ached on cold mornings, but the pain had become a reminder of the night that changed everything rather than a source of constant suffering. Victoria's transformation from corporate executive to community advocate had been gradual but complete, her business suits replaced by jeans and sweaters that reflected her new priorities. She had moved into a modest house 3 blocks from Rick's apartment, close enough for daily dinners and homework help, but separate enough to maintain the independence that both of them valued. The girls had their own bedrooms in both houses, their belongings scattered between locations in the casual way of children who felt secure in multiple spaces. The wedding, when it finally happened, was a small affair held in Peterson's grocery after hours, with Sophie and Bella serving as co-maids of honor and Peterson himself officiating with a license he had obtained online for the occasion. The guest list included Mrs. Chen, who had eventually forgiven Rick for the upheaval his relationship with Victoria had brought to their quiet neighborhood, and Dr. Martinez, whose expertise had been crucial in exposing Sterling's pattern of abuse. The reception featured sandwiches from the deli counter and a cake that Sophie and Bella had decorated with enough frosting flowers to stock a garden center. Rick's photography business had grown beyond anything he had imagined possible during his years behind the grocery store counter, but he still worked part-time for Peterson as a way of staying connected to the community that had supported him through the darkest period of his life. The foundation's work had expanded to include training programs for family court judges and legislative advocacy for reforms that would prevent wealthy abusers from gaming the system. Victoria's testimony before congressional committees had made her a reluctant expert on the intersection of domestic violence and legal corruption, her corporate background lending credibility to arguments that might otherwise be dismissed as emotional rhetoric. The final photograph in Rick's exhibition showed Sophie and Bella at ages 9 and 7, their arms around each other as they stood in front of Peterson's grocery on a sunny Saturday morning. The image captured something ineffable about their relationship, the way that trauma had strengthened rather than weakened their bond, and how their families had grown together despite obstacles that might have destroyed other relationships. Victoria's reflection was visible in the store window behind the girls, her camera raised to capture the same moment from a different angle, the parallel perspectives creating a visual metaphor for the way their lives had become intertwined. The community center exhibition became an annual tradition, with new photographs added each year to document the ongoing work of the foundation and the families it served. Rick's images had helped change legislation in 12 states, providing visual evidence of the human cost of legal systems that favored wealth over justice. Victoria's foundation had grown into a national organization with offices in major cities, but its headquarters remained in Maplewood as a reminder that real change often began in small towns with ordinary people who refused to accept that injustice was inevitable. On quiet evenings when the photography equipment was stored away and the foundation's work was reduced to emails and phone calls, Rick and Victoria would sit on their front porch and watch Sophie and Bella play in the yard they now shared. The girls had created elaborate games that involved rescuing stuffed animals from imaginary legal troubles, their play incorporating themes of justice and protection that reflected the adult world they had been forced to navigate. Rick's camera sat beside his chair, loaded with film but momentarily forgotten, as he focused on the simple pleasure of watching his daughter laugh without fear. The scar on Rick's shoulder had faded to a thin white line that was barely visible unless someone knew to look for it, but the photograph of him shielding Bella still hung in Peterson's grocery as a reminder of the night that changed everything. Customers often asked about the story behind the image, and Peterson would tell them about the evening when his employee proved that heroism wasn't about capes and superpowers, but about ordinary people making extraordinary choices when extraordinary choices were required. The story had become part of Maplewood's folklore, a tale that parents told their children about the importance of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Rick's Polaroid camera, a relic from his marriage to Rebecca, had found new purpose documenting the informal moments that digital photography couldn't quite capture. The instant images accumulated in shoeboxes and photo albums, creating a visual diary of their reconstructed family that emphasized authenticity over perfection. Sophie had inherited her father's eye for composition and her stepmother's strategic thinking, her own photographs showing promise that suggested a future career combining art and advocacy. Bella's artistic talents leaned toward drawing and painting, her images of family life often featuring protective figures standing between smaller figures and shadowy threats. The Foundation's annual report featured Rick's photography prominently, the images providing emotional context for statistics about custody battles and legal reform that might otherwise seem abstract to donors and legislators. Victoria's transformation from corporate CEO to social justice advocate had been documented in business magazines as a case study in career reinvention, but the articles missed the deeper truth about how trauma and love could reshape someone's understanding of what really mattered. The wealth that had once defined her identity became a tool for change rather than an end in itself, her privilege finally serving a purpose beyond personal comfort. As winter settled over Maplewood for the fourth time since the night of the shooting, Rick found himself thinking about the chain of events that had brought them all together, and wondering if Rebecca would approve of the life he had built with Victoria and the girls. The answer came to him while developing photographs in the darkroom he had built in their basement, the red light casting familiar shadows as images slowly appeared in the chemical bath. Rebecca had always believed that love was meant to multiply rather than divide, and the family they had created was proof that loss didn't have to be the end of the story, but could instead be the beginning of something even more beautiful. The last photograph Rick took that year showed Victoria teaching Sophie to drive in the empty parking lot behind Peterson's grocery, Bella bouncing in the back seat with excitement as the car lurched through its first tentative movements. The image captured the ordinary magic of a moment that would have been impossible to imagine during those first dark days after the shooting, when the future seemed determined by forces beyond their control. But here they were, a family built from choice rather than chance, their love tested by federal courts and media scrutiny, and emerged stronger for having survived the testing.